There's a reason 12 of the wealthiest families in Robertson County, Tennessee, quietly changed their surnames between 1847 and 1860. For more than 20 years, these men had ruled everything that mattered: the courts, the banks, the land, and the futures of anyone unfortunate enough to fall into their shadow. Then, in the space of a few savage years, their fortunes crumbled, their reputations rotted, and they scattered across 4 different states, some disappearing as far as Texas and Missouri, desperate to outrun a past they themselves had created. What they were fleeing wasn't war, plague, or financial collapse. It was a woman. Her name was Eliza Harwell, born enslaved on the Harwell plantation in 1824, with one blue eye and one brown eye, an unsettling contrast that made people whisper that she could see things ordinary people could not. But what destroyed those 12 families had nothing to do with curses or second sight. It came from something far more dangerous in a society built on lies: what Eliza had witnessed over 23 years, what she understood about how power truly worked in Tennessee, and what she did when she finally had the chance to speak. Robertson County in 1824 was a place of brutal contradictions, where tobacco fields rolled green and profitable under the sun, while the Cumberland River wound through valleys that had once belonged to Cherokee families forced westward, their absence conveniently forgotten by those who lived off the land they left behind. Springfield, the county seat, dressed itself in respectability brick courthouses, merchant homes with wide porches, polite church-going families, while beneath the surface everything rested on chains. Whips and human beings counted as inventory. Tobacco was king and cotton was rising fast. And the men who owned the land owned everything else: elections, court verdicts, loans, crops, and lives. On 800 acres of prime bottomland stood the Harwell plantation, ruled by Colonel James Harwell, a man with a public reputation for honor and a private reputation, whispered in the enslaved quarters after dark, that hinted at something colder and more ruthless. He was a county magistrate, a friend to men in Nashville with real political weight, and a host of private gatherings where deals were struck that never appeared in any ledger. Behind his impressive 2-story brick house, beyond the polished silver and the carefully ironed table linens, lay the cabins where 73 enslaved people lived, worked, and tried to survive without being broken. It was there, in one of those cramped wooden cabins, that an old midwife named Ruth delivered a baby girl on a March night in 1824 and felt her hands tremble when she saw the child. Ruth had delivered 3 generations of babies, free and enslaved, seen twins and stillbirths. Miracles and horrors, but never eyes like these. One pale gray blue, bright as winter sky over water, the other deep brown, nearly black. She knew no medical term like heterochromia. What she knew were stories about people born with mismatched eyes who saw spirits, carried curses, or drew misfortune like a magnet. She forced her voice to stay even as she wrapped the child in cloth. "Child got different eyes," she murmured, pretending calm. "Seen it once before. That one lived to be old. Nothing wrong with her, just different." But Sarah, the baby's mother, noticed the tremor in Ruth's hands and the quick, anxious glance toward the door. Sarah had survived the Middle Passage as a child, crossed an ocean in chains, and learned to read danger without needing anyone to say it out loud. Holding her newborn close, she understood instantly that the world would try to turn those eyes into a curse. In that moment, she made a decision that would ripple through decades. She named her daughter Eliza, a name she'd heard during the mistress's Bible readings, a name that sounded strong and important, like it belonged to someone history was supposed to remember. And she vowed quietly to raise her as normally as the brutal rules of plantation life would allow, no matter how much the others whispered. For the first 6 years of Eliza's life, that fragile plan held better than anyone might have expected. Among the children in the quarters, curiosity about her eyes faded quickly. Children cared more about games, food, and avoiding the whip than about omens. They chased each other between cabins, shared thin meals, and learned the same harsh lessons about when to speak and when to stay silent. The white children who occasionally caught sight of Eliza were kept back by their parents, warned that mismatched eyes meant ill luck or worse. And they treated her like something to be watched but not touched. But what set Eliza apart had less to do with her eyes than with her mind. From the beginning, she remembered things other people forgot. She could hear a story once and repeat it word for word days later. She remembered conversations exactly who spoke, what they said, how they said it. By 4, she could recite entire songs after a single hearing. By 5, she could describe events from 2 years earlier with unnerving clarity, who had been there, what they wore, what the weather had been like. By 6, she was no longer just a strange-looking child. She was something far more unusual in a world built on keeping enslaved people ignorant, a mind that could not be erased. That same year, she was moved from the fields and cabin row into the big house, assigned to work under Martha, the head housekeeper. Martha was a woman who had learned to survive 3 decades of plantation politics through quiet authority, careful observation, and a ruthless understanding of when to swallow anger to live another day. It did not take her long to see what made Eliza dangerous. The girl needed to be told something once, and she had it forever. She remembered which plates belonged to which guests, which cabinet held which silver, which visitor had complained about what last month. She remembered and repeated without error, lest Martha stopped her. One night, after the house had gone still and the chorus of crickets and frogs had risen around the cabins, Martha pulled Sarah aside and whispered the truth that every intelligent enslaved parent eventually feared. "That child remembers too much," she said, her voice low and urgent. "She hears something once, she got it forever. I seen her repeat a conversation from 2 weeks past, word for word. That kind of thing gets noticed. And notice ain't always safe. Intelligence in an enslaved person was a paradox, valuable enough to be exploited, dangerous enough to be destroyed." Sarah understood without needing more explanation. If white men realized how much Eliza understood, they might decide she was an asset or decide she was a threat that needed to disappear. So, with the pain only a mother in chains can understand, Sarah began teaching her daughter how to hide her own brilliance. Eliza learned to ask for instructions twice, even when she didn't need to pretend confusion she didn't feel, to misplace small details on purpose so that people would underestimate her. But some things could not be hidden. Her eyes still drew glances. Old women still crossed themselves or looked away when she met their gaze. And the men who ruled Robertson County still walked past her as though she were furniture, never imagining that every careless word they spoke in her presence was being recorded with perfect clarity. By the time she was 6, Eliza had already begun, without meaning to become something none of them believed existed in an enslaved girl, a living archive of their secrets. And on a sweltering August evening in 1830, as powerful men gathered in the Harwell dining room to drink bourbon and talk business, that memory would turn a quiet child with strange eyes into the silent witness to a crime that would echo through the rest of her life. The drought of 1830 settled over Robertson County like a curse in its own right. The tobacco leaves curled and yellowed in the fields. The Cumberland River shrank into a sluggish ribbon of exposed to stone, and tempers frayed under the relentless heat. The enslaved people worked longer hours hauling water from farther distances, the sun beating down like a punishment. Inside the main house, where cooler air drifted through open windows at dusk, 6-year-old Liza moved quietly from table to table, refilling glasses, clearing plates, and trying, just as Martha had taught her, to be small, silent, and invisible. That August evening was no ordinary dinner. Colonel James Harwell had invited 11 of the most powerful men in Middle Tennessee to his home. They arrived in carriages that raised dust along the long drive, stepping into the house as though they owned not only Robertson County, but the future itself. The dining room glowed with candlelight, reflected in polished silver. The guests, plantation owners, judges, merchants, politicians. and one land speculator with a reputation of acquiring things that were never truly for sale drank and loosened their tongues as bourbon warmed their blood. Eliza moved among them like a shadow, a child carrying a water pitcher almost too heavy for her arms. They did not look at her. They did not lower their voices. They never imagined she could understand the meaning of their words, much less remember them. But she could, and she did. She heard Edward Vance boast about tricking a widow out of her late husband's land with documentation he'd acquired through the proper channels. His voice carried the smug pride of a man who believed cheating the vulnerable was a sign of intelligence, not cruelty. She heard Judge Benjamin Thornton, a man sworn to uphold the law, laugh as he described dismissing a case brought by a freed black man named Isaac who had spent 2 years trying to reclaim his 3 children, sold before his manumission papers were finalized. Couldn't let him win, the judge said, swirling his drink. Would have opened the floodgates. Around the table, heads nodded. To them, stealing children wasn't tragedy. It was maintenance of order. She heard Colonel Harwell himself discuss how he planned to influence the county assessor to undervalue certain properties along the Cumberland River. With the right pressure in the right places, small farmers would be forced to sell. Their land would flow directly into the hands of the men at that tableland that would never be recorded as stolen, only acquired. But it was the next conversation that made Eliza freeze, pitcher still in her hands, her young heart thudding as if she'd suddenly stepped into a world she wasn't meant to see. They were discussing a woman, Grace Thornhill, a free woman of color who owned 40 acres of prime farmland inherited from her white father. She paid her taxes, kept her papers in perfect order, and made a modest living selling vegetables and eggs to Springfield's market. She had turned down repeated offers to sell her land. That refusal sealed her fate. Colonel Harwell spoke about her casually, as if discussing a crop or a piece of equipment. A woman alone, no wealthy kin, no legal counsel. Land that valuable will find its way into more capable hands one way or another. Nearby, Attorney Marcus Pifford mused aloud about possible irregularities that might suddenly appear in her father's will if examined closely. Judge Thornton nodded thoughtfully, suggesting that her freedom papers could be revisited to ensure their legitimacy if someone were to raise a question. Edward Vance speculated that if she were pressured with debts, he himself might be able to prove her property could be seized. Legally, they spoke of the destruction of her life as if planning a harvest schedule, as if she were already gone. 2 months later, on a cold October night, Grace Thornhill's farmhouse burned so fast and so completely that neighbors swore the flames traveled unnatural quick. She died inside, trapped as the roof collapsed. 3 weeks after her burial, her land appeared in court records as subject to debt reclamation. Marcus Pifford filed the papers. Judge Thornton approved them. Edward Vance bought the land for less than half its value. The Springfield newspaper published a brief, polite obituary. No one mentioned the dinner, the conversation, the plan she had never stood a chance against. But Eliza remembered. She remembered every detail, who said what, the tone of their voices, the way their faces looked in candlelight. She remembered the laughter, the smugness, the certainty that they were untouchable. She was 6 years old, but she already understood something most adults never learned. Power wasn't just what men did with their hands. It was what they believed no one would ever repeat. And while those men moved on with their lives, confident their secrets were buried with Grace Thornhill, a child with 2 different colored eyes carried their words inside her with perfect clarity. The night Grace Thornhill died was the night everything changed for Robertson County, because the only person who remembered the truth was the one they never imagined would someday speak it. The death of Grace Thornhill faded from public memory almost as quickly as her farmhouse collapsed in flames. By 1831, Springfield was back to its usual rhythm court days. Market days, Sunday sermons, and the constant hum of tobacco and cotton money flowing into the pockets of the men who controlled everything. But while the county forgot, Eliza did not. She carried the memory of that dinner the way some people carried scars, quiet, invisible, but deep. As she grew from 6 to 8, then 9, her unusual gift sharpened. She remembered not only the words spoken in August 1830, but every conversation that followed, every new scheme, every whispered plot, every casual cruelty exchanged between men who thought nothing of speaking openly from the silent. Black girl who poured their water and cleared their plates. She became something extraordinary, something those men believed did not exist, a living, breathing archive of their corruption. By 1833, under the watchful eye of Martha, the head housekeeper, Eliza had become an indispensable part of the main house. Martha knew exactly what she had become and exactly how dangerous that made her. But in the winter of that year, during a cold snap that froze the Cumberland River solid, pneumonia took Martha's life. On her final night, she called Eliza to her bedside, her breath coming in thin, painful gasps. "You got a gift," she whispered, "but gifts turn into curses if you're not careful. You must learn what to keep inside. Some things you speak too soon, you die with them." And then, gripping Eliza's hand with surprising strength, she added, "Promise me you'll stay alive long enough to choose your own life. Don't let these people use you till you break." That was their last conversation. Martha died before sunrise, and within weeks her wooden grave marker faded into the landscape. But her warning lived inside Eliza. She would need it by the time Eliza reached 11. She had seen and heard enough to understand something no child should understand. Robertson County was not ruled by law, nor by elected officials, but by a private alliance of 12 men who coordinated every major decision in Middle Tennessee. They had no official name, no written charter, no public meetings. They didn't need any. They had power, and they had each other. They met in places where no records existed, Colonel Harwell's office. The dining room after dinner, the porch late at night when the oil lamps were turned low. They trusted that the enslaved people nearby heard nothing, understood nothing, remembered nothing. They were wrong. They were being documented by a child with perfect recall. There was Colonel James Harwell, the host and organizer, whose plantation served as the association's gathering place and whose role at the county magistrate ensured that the law bowed where he pointed. There was Judge Benjamin Thornton, whose court rulings determined winners and losers long before any evidence was heard. There was Edward Vance, the land speculator who profited from destroyed families and manufactured debts. There was Robert Killebrew, a landowner whose political ties in Nashville gave him advanced knowledge of legislation that could reshape entire counties. There was Samuel Batson, who controlled the only cotton gin within 20 miles and kept small farmers perpetually indebted through rigged scales. There was William Greer, keeper of land office records, who could make inconvenient documents disappear or reappear as needed. There was Thomas Whitley, a merchant whose credit system trapped farmers in cycles of debt that ended in foreclosure. There was Jefferson Cunningham, who controlled the only bank in the county and could destroy a man with the stroke of a pen. There was Henry Cartwright, owner of the biggest tobacco warehouse, who set prices that determined whether farmers survived the winter. There was Daniel Yatesman, the state legislator who served as the association's eyes and ears in Nashville. There was Marcus Pifford, the attorney who crafted legal justification for any wrongdoing they needed hidden. And finally, there was Alexander Darden, who ran the Springfield slave auction house, controlling the county's most brutal commodity, its people. Together, these 12 men were the Springfield Association, though no one outside their circle ever used that name. They operated like a single organism sharing information, coordinating land thefts, manipulating court decisions, and ensuring their wealth multiplied while the rest of Robertson County struggled just to stay alive. And night after night, year after year, Eliza quietly absorbed every detail by 1838, when Eliza was 14. Her role inside the household changed in a way that made her both more valuable and more vulnerable. Colonel Harwell realized that her memory could serve him not just as entertainment, but as a weapon. He began testing her, asking her to repeat conversations other association members had held weeks earlier. He used her like a hidden ledger, comparing what he'd been told versus what others had actually said. Each test proved the same truth. Eliza forgot nothing. Soon, Harwell stationed her deliberately in rooms where sensitive discussions took place, trusting her to store secrets more reliably than paper could burn. Paper could be seized, but a young enslaved woman? No one would ever believe her. No one but him even knew what she was capable of. Or so he thought. What Harwell didn't realize was that while he used Eliza for his own advantage, Eliza had begun using them too. She listened. She connected patterns. She understood relationships, motivations, weaknesses. And slowly, quietly, she began to see the structural flaw in the association. Their empires overlapped. Their crimes were intertwined. If one man fell, the rest could not stand. Every stolen farm, every fraudulent will, every forged deed, every rigged court case was connected to another man at that table. They were a single web, and Eliza was the spider at its center, quiet and visible, absorbing everything. She did not yet know how she would use the truth she carried, or when, or through whom. She only knew that someday, somehow, these men would regret every careless word they had spoken in front of a girl they believed incapable of thought. And long before the scandal erupted, long before newspapers called it corruption, long before 12 families fled Tennessee in disgrace, the seeds of their downfall were already being planted. In the memory of a child with two different colored eyes, dot by the time the year 1841 arrived, Eliza Harwell was no longer the silent child who slipped through rooms unnoticed. At 17, she had become a young woman with a reputation whispered in both the big house and the quarters. A girl who remembered everything, who could repeat a man's words back to him years later, as if she were reciting scripture. And as her memory grew sharper, the man who had relied on it the most, the aging Colonel James Harwell, began to fade. His cough had worsened through the winter of 1840, a rasping sound that echoed through the halls at night. By spring, his strength had collapsed entirely. The county doctor called it lung trouble. The enslaved community called it the price of a lifetime spent breathing tobacco, dust, and secrets. Whatever the cause, the colonel was dying. And with him, the delicate balance of power that held the Springfield Association together. Into the vacuum stepped his son, James Harwell, Jr., a man with his father's hunger for power but none of his father's restraint. At 26, educated, ambitious, and desperate to prove himself, James Jr. returned from Nashville, ready to inherit not only the plantation, but the authority his father wielded over Robertson County. He had grown up in the shadow of the association. He'd watched the dinners, overheard the laughter, and believed he understood how power worked. But what he lacked was something his father had mastered, the skill of moving quietly. James Jr. wanted to take control fast, loudly, and decisively. That made him dangerous. The association tolerated him at first. Men like Judge Thornton and Edward Vance saw him as a continuation of the order they had helped build. Others older, more cautious, wondered privately whether the young Harwell could handle the trust and silence required to maintain the machine they'd created. The more the association doubted him, the more James Jr. sought to impress them, and the more reckless he became. For Eliza, this shift changed everything. She had spent years cataloging the workings of the association, its conversations, schemes, and whispered agreements. Now she watched a young man try to wield that system like a weapon he barely understood. James Jr. began holding meetings more frequently, inviting the association to the plantation even as his father weakened upstairs. Where the colonel had relied on meticulous planning and subtle influence, James Jr. used bravado. He made promises he couldn't keep, proposed aggressive land acquisitions that ignored political risks, and bragged about future wealth built on strategies he barely grasped. In every meeting, Eliza was there refilling glasses, standing against the wall, cataloging every foolish misstep with silent clarity. The more James Jr. tried to impress the association, the more he used her memory as proof of his strength. He asked her to repeat things said weeks earlier, to confirm numbers that others had forgotten, to recite details that made him seem more knowledgeable than he actually was. But in doing so, he made the mistake his father had never made. He let the association see what she truly was. There came a night in February 1843 when everything changed. The colonel was bedridden, too sick to attend his own meetings. In his office downstairs, James Jr. sat with Edward Vance and attorney Marcus Pifford, discussing new expansion schemes, plans to seize land along the river and manipulate debt records for struggling farmers. Eliza stood quietly in the corner, head bowed. James Jr., already flushed with drink and ambition, gestured toward her with careless confidence. "Her memory is better than any written ledger," he declared. "I'm thinking we could lease her out when others need discretion. No paper trail. No evidence." Vance stiffened. The older men liked control, but not risks. Leasing out a servant who remembered everything was not control. It was exposure. Pifford stared at Eliza for a long moment, his lawyer's mind calculating something James Jr. was too arrogant to notice. Then, in a low voice, he said the words that changed the room. "You don't see it, do you? She already knows she's valuable. She's been listening for years. The question isn't whether she understands, it's what she plans to do with that knowledge." James Jr. laughed, the sound brittle and defensive. "She's property," he insisted. "She can know whatever she wants." Who would believe her? But his bravado rang hollow even to the men sitting around him. The association had spent 20 years keeping all evidence off paper. That meant Eliza was the evidence. One living witness who carried every secret they had carefully kept off the books. For the first time, fear flickered across the faces of powerful men. And for the first time, Eliza understood her position fully, not as a servant, not as an ornament, but as the single point of failure in an empire built on corruption over the next 2 years. As the colonel declined and James Jr. rose, Eliza watched everything tighten like a rope. Discussions became sharper, angrier. Old alliances cracked. Trust began to rot. And James Jr., in his desperation to prove himself, made the most catastrophic decision of all, one that would ultimately destroy him, his family, and the entire association. He decided to sell Eliza, not because she was useless, but because she was too dangerous to keep. She knew too much. She had heard too much, and her memory, once the source of their confidence, had become the greatest threat they had ever faced. But the one thing James Jr. never understood was the same thing his father had, never bothered to question. Eliza was not helpless. She had spent 17 years studying how powerful men operated, how they schemed, how they manipulated, how they hid their crimes. Now, as the chains of her life tightened, she began planning with the same precision they had used to build their empire. The association was slipping. The balance was breaking. And Eliza Harwell, quiet, observant, and underestimated, was ready to make her move. By the spring of 1844, the Harwell plantation was rotting from the inside, even if the big house still looked polished from the road. Colonel Harwell's breath had grown thin and rattling, his voice barely more than a whisper. For 2 decades, he had been the silent architect who kept the Springfield Association running smoothly, balancing egos, smoothing conflicts, reminding 12 corrupt men how to move as one. But as his life slipped away upstairs, the machine he had built began to grind and fracture. Downstairs, James Harwell Jr. was losing control. He wanted so desperately to prove himself worthy of the power he'd spent his whole life watching his father wield. But where the colonel had been cold and calculated, James Jr. was impulsive, proud, and reckless. His hunger to impress the association made him dangerous to everyone, including himself. And then came the disaster that pushed everything into collapse, the Cotton Futures scheme. A fast-talking speculator from Memphis arrived with rumors of crop failures in Georgia and South Carolina. Prices would rise, he claimed. Fortunes could be made. The opportunity was once in a generation. James Jr. eager to prove he was a visionary like his father, invested $8,000 without hesitation plantation money he had no authority to risk. He convinced 3 other association members to join him. They followed his lead, believing the Harwell name still meant wisdom. But the scheme was a lie. By August, the truth surfaced. There were no widespread crop failures. The Memphis speculator had vanished with thousands of dollars. $20,000, the equivalent of more than a decade's profit for a mid-sized plantation, was gone forever. The association erupted. Robert Killebrew, the largest investor, accused James Jr. of incompetence. Samuel Batson demanded immediate repayment. Edward Vance implied that perhaps the Harwell family's leadership was no longer beneficial or safe for the group. The meetings grew heated. Yelling replaced strategy. Threats replaced trust. The Springfield Association, once a tight machine of coordinated cruelty, was becoming a battlefield of blame. And in the middle of it all stood Eliza, now 20 years old, quiet, observant, and carrying within her the entire hidden history of their crimes. What none of the men realized was that in these moments of tension, they loosened their tongues even more. Their arguments revealed alliances, fractures, fears, and desperate plans. And Eliza absorbed it all. But the man whose future depended most on stopping the unraveling of the association was blind to the danger, standing right beside him. Because in October 1844, after a particularly vicious confrontation with Killebrew, James Jr. finally saw Eliza not as an asset, but as a liability. Not a servant with a useful memory, but a woman who knew too much. And so he made the decision that would destroy him. He would sell her, not locally, where people knew about her strange eyes and eerie memory, but far away south to Mississippi or Louisiana, where she would be swallowed by a massive plantation and disappear into anonymity. He contacted William Hatcher, a slave trader known for moving coffles quietly between Nashville and Natchez. Hatcher agreed to take Eliza in July 1845 as part of a larger transport. The price was set $950, slightly above market rate, reflecting her age and skills. She would be marched south with chains around her wrists, never to return, never to speak, never to be believed, never to threaten the association again. James Jr. thought he had solved the problem. He thought selling her would secure his future. He thought removing her would erase the past. But in November 1844, Eliza overheard him discussing the sale with Thomas Whitley, heard her fate sealed in the same casual tone they used when discussing crops or horses. She had 8 months before the coffle left. 8 months before she was swallowed by the deep south. 8 months before she vanished forever. 8 months to make the impossible happen. To free herself? To destroy the 12 men who thought themselves untouchable. To pull down the empire that had stolen land, lives, and futures for 2 decades. And so Eliza began to plan not with panic, but with the cold, methodical strategy she had learned from the very men who believed she was nothing. She studied their methods, their lies, their pressure points. She observed who feared scandal, who hid money, who bribed whom, whose legacy was fragile, whose reputation mattered. And at night, when everyone slept, she practiced writing with charcoal on scraps of wood, with ash on the fireplace stones, with fingers tracing letters in dirt she erased at dawn. By March 1845, she could write clearly enough to send a letter. By May, she had something more valuable than skill opportunity. A preacher was coming to the plantation. A man known for speaking against corruption. A man not under the association's control. And Eliza, forced into silence her entire life, was about to speak for the first time. Not in front of a courtroom. Not in front of a jury. But to one man who could change everything if he believed her dot in late May 1845. Just weeks before she was to be marched south in chains, the opportunity Eliza had been waiting for finally appeared. A traveling Methodist preacher named Reverend Thomas Walsh arrived in Springfield to conduct a week of revival services. He was known across Middle Tennessee for fiery sermons condemning greed, corruption, and the moral rot that hid behind respectable faces. More importantly, he was not part of the county's power structure. He owed the 12 men nothing, and they had no influence over him. When he came to the Harwell plantation to stay for 3 nights, a customary arrangement for circuit preachers, Eliza recognized her only chance. If anyone would listen to truth spoken by a woman society considered invisible, it would be a man who preached that God did not respect the powerful more than the powerless. But she had only one chance to reach him, and it had to be done without drawing suspicion. On the night of his arrival, while the household ate dinner and Walsh's room stood empty, Eliza slipped into the guest chamber with a folded letter hidden beneath her apron. It was the first letter she had ever written in her life, quietly composed by lamplight, rewritten again and again in charcoal until the words were clear and steady. She placed it under the pillow where he would find it when he retired for the night. The letter was simple, careful, and devastating. An anonymous message stating that systematic corruption, land theft, and court manipulation were occurring in Robertson County, that someone with perfect memory could recount exact details of these crimes, and that if he wished to hear more, he should walk past the large oak at the east boundary at dawn. The risk was enormous. If Walsh dismissed the letter, she was doomed. If he told the Harwell family, she was dead. But if he came alone, if he believed her, everything could change. That night, Eliza barely slept, lying awake in the dark cabin row with her heart pounding. The 8 months of fear and planning twisting inside her like a nata at dawn the next morning. Mist still heavy over the fields. Reverend Walsh walked toward the boundary oak as if taking a casual early morning stroll. Eliza stepped from behind the tree, her mismatched eyes catching the first thin line of sunlight. The preacher froze, startled. He had expected a man, a stranger, maybe even a trap, but not a 21-year-old enslaved woman staring at him with absolute clarity and no fear left in her voice. "You wrote the letter?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said. "I can read. I can write. And I remember everything." She told him about the 12 men, the association, and how for 15 years she had been the silent witness to their schemes. She described the murder of Grace Thornhill, the fraudulent foreclosures, the rigged court cases, the bribes, the forged documents, the destroyed families. Walsh listened, horrified, skeptical, shaken. Memory was fickle, people misremembered all the time. He asked why he should believe her. In response, Eliza recited his entire sermon from Tuesday night, word for word, including the Bible verses, pauses, changes in tone, and the closing prayer. She even repeated the thunderstorm metaphor he had improvised on the spot. Walsh's face turned pale. His knees seemed to weaken. He knew he had witnessed something extraordinary, something dangerous and undeniable. She then told him the final truth. She had 8 weeks before being sold south, and if she was taken, those secrets would die with her. If he wanted justice, he had to help her secure her freedom before July. Walsh left that meeting shaken to his core. All day he prayed, paced, wrote notes, tore them up, and wrestled with what he had heard. But by nightfall he had made his decision. Using contacts in Nashville, lawyers, anti-slavery society members, reformers who despised plantation corruption, he began quietly arranging support. Within days, word came back to Eliza through a free black laborer who sometimes worked on the plantation. "The preacher believes you. Plans are being made. Stay ready." Money began to move. Legal strategies took shape. A network of abolitionists, lawyers, and church supporters formed around they had never met, a woman none of them would forget. Meanwhile, in the big house, James Jr. remained blissfully unaware that the person he planned to sell south had already set his destruction in motion. He believed he was eliminating a threat. He had no idea he had given that threat time to sharpen itself into a weapon. 8 months earlier, Eliza had been powerless. Now she had allies gathering in the shadows, people with influence, resources, and the ability to speak where she could not. The dawn meeting beneath the old oak tree had changed everything. The silent witness was no longer silent. And for the first time in her life, freedom was more than a dream. It was a plan already in motion. July 1845 arrived like a ticking clock. The coffled in Mississippi chains, wagons, sunburnt marshes, and disappearances was scheduled to leave in just 2 days. James Harwell Jr. felt confident he had solved his problems. The dangerous girl with the impossible memory would be gone. The association would regain its stability, and his own authority would finally be respected. What he did not know was that every hour he felt safer, his danger was growing. Because on July 5th, a carriage rolled up the Harwell Plantation Road carrying a Nashville attorney named Samuel Porterfield, representing a Christian charity group. He brought cash more than James Jr. expected, and an offer to purchase one enslaved woman. Eliza Porterfield presented the story smoothly, claiming the organization wished to free a woman as an act of religious benevolence. These purchases weren't common, but they weren't suspicious either. And James Jr., desperate for money and too arrogant to question a gift falling into his lap, took the offer instantly. He negotiated the price up to $1,300, took the cash, signed the papers, and believed he had manipulated the situation brilliantly. What he had actually done was deliver the only witness to his empire's crimes directly into legal protection in Nashville. Within a week, Eliza Harwell stood in Davidson County as a free woman, no longer property, no longer silenced by law, and fully protected by people prepared to fight for her. When word reached the Springfield Association, panic spread faster than wildfire. James Jr. called an emergency meeting. All 12 men gathered at the Harwell plantation on a July night, thick with heat and mosquitoes, their faces pale, their voices trembling beneath practiced calm. They had finally realized the truth. They had lost control of their living archive. Eliza knew every land theft, every fraudulent court ruling, every manufactured debt, every forged document. She had overheard conversations stretching back 15 years across every crime they believed safely hidden. They asked questions none of them wanted to hear out loud. Could they buy her silence? No, she had chosen freedom over disappearing. Could they discredit her? No, she had the support of Nashville lawyers and reformers. Could they harm her? Absolutely not. She was now under public protection in a city where their influence meant nothing. They understood in that suffocating room that there was no solution. None. The system they had built to shield themselves, oral agreements. No paper trails, secret meetings had twisted into the perfect weapon against them. Eliza didn't need documents. She was the documents. She didn't need evidence. She was the evidence. The legal storm began within weeks. The first case concerned the land of Grace Thornhill, whose death had been ruled an accident 15 years earlier. Her surviving family had never been able to challenge the foreclosure until Eliza testified. In a Davidson County courtroom, she recited the exact conversation she'd overheard in August 1830. 12 men, casually plotting Grace's destruction, naming methods, assigning roles, joking about outcomes. Judges, clerks, and spectators listened in stunned silence as Eliza repeated the past with perfect detail. Defense attorneys tried to undermine her memory until she repeated both attorneys' opening statements from 2 days earlier, word for word, tone for tone, proving her recall was not natural but extraordinary. The court ruled in favor of the Thornhill heirs, and suddenly the entire structure of Robertson County seemed built on rotten beams. Case after case followed. Farmers whose land had been stolen, families whose debts had been fabricated, widows defrauded, wills altered, records lost, court rulings manipulated, all found their way into court filings. Anti-slavery societies funded the plaintiffs. Nashville newspapers spilled ink on the scandal. Northern abolitionist papers carried headlines about corruption in Tennessee. And everywhere, in every courtroom, stood Eliza calm, composed, and devastating. She named dates. She named sums of money. She named schemes that matched perfectly with surviving scraps of documentation. She named the men and the roles they played. She connected threads no one else had ever seen together. One by one, the 12 pillars of Robertson County collapsed, Edward Vance. The speculator saw his land stolen back in court and fled to Texas, dying bankrupt. Jefferson Cunningham, the banker, resigned in disgrace and faced investigation for loan fraud. Samuel Batson, the cotton gin owner, was sued by 37 farmers and lost everything. William Greer, the land officer, was removed for falsifying county records. Judge Thornton was convicted of misconduct and removed from the bench. Marcus Pifford, the attorney, was disbarred. James Harwell Jr., desperate and drowning in debt, lost the Harwell plantation to foreclosure in 1846. He vanished into the Arkansas frontier, never to reclaim anything his family had built. By 1847, the Springfield Association no longer existed. 12 families who had ruled Middle Tennessee for 2 decades were ruined. Their fortunes dissipated. Their reputations destroyed. Their children and grandchildren quietly changed their surnames to escape the shame. They said they were cursed by the woman with 2 different colored eyes. But the truth was simpler, colder, and far more just they were destroyed by the memory of the one person they believed could never speak. The woman they tried to silence had become the voice that tore down their empire. And in the ruins of their power, Middle Tennessee began whispering a name with fear, awe, and disbelief: Eliza Harwell. When the last courtroom door closed in 1847 and the verdicts were read, Tennessee newspapers declared the Springfield Association dead. But for Eliza Harwell, the end of the trials was not an end at all, only a turning of a page. After 3 years of being questioned, cross-examined, doubted, threatened, and defended, she stepped out of public view with the quiet dignity of someone who had already paid the price of truth many times over. She did not return to Robertson County. She never would. The land where she was born had been built on the suffering of 73 enslaved people, her mother among them. The fields that once burned Grace Thornhill's house were now stained with the reputation of 12 men who believed their power eternal. There was nothing left there worth reclaiming instead. Eliza built a life in Nashville simple, modest, and entirely her own. The Tennessee Anti-Slavery Society provided her with a small sum of money, and several families whose stolen property had been restored contributed quietly to her support. She rented a small room in a free black community and began working as a laundress, taking in clothes from households throughout the city. It was hard work, but honest work. After years of being forced to carry secrets that belonged to other people, she chose a life where nobody controlled her story but herself. In September 1849, she married David Porter, a freed carpenter whose calm nature matched the quiet strength she carried. Together, they built a family of 3 children who would grow up not with chains or whispered warnings, but with books, schools, and the knowledge that their mother had changed history in ways few people would ever fully understand. Through the 1850s and 1860s, Eliza lived mostly in the margins of public life, but traces of her still appeared in scattered court transcripts. Now and then, a named woman with a clear, exacting memory and 2 eyes of different colors was noted as providing testimony in property cases where older disputes resurfaced. She never sought attention. She never repeated what she had endured. But when truth was needed, when a buried detail mattered, when a forgotten conversation could save someone from being cheated, she stepped forward quietly, said what needed to be said, and slipped back into her private life. The 12 families she had exposed never recovered. Some fled Tennessee altogether. Some changed their names to bury the shame. Some lived out their days pretending this scandal had been exaggerated, that the girl with the strange eyes had been coached or manipulated. But their land was gone, their power broken, and their legacies rotted beyond repair. Their descendants grew up hearing whispers about a curse, a woman whose gaze destroyed fortunes, whose words toppled an empire. Yet the truth was never supernatural. It was simpler, more human, and infinitely more dangerous. She remembered what others chose to forget. In 1873, pneumonia carried Eliza's life to a quiet end at the age of 49. She was buried in Nashville's city cemetery in the section reserved for black citizens. Her grave marked by a simple wooden cross. With time, the cross weathered, collapsed, and disappeared. By the 1920s, the exact spot where she rested was lost beneath shifting soil and new construction. No monument was ever built in Robertson County. No historical marker stands on the land where she tore down a dynasty with the power of a single, unstoppable truth. But in the unrecorded corners of Tennessee memory and the soft-spoken stories told by those who still remember the scandal and the fear that made 12. Families changed their names are present still. Lingers. Part of the record of her life was destroyed in the courthouse fire of 1891, a blaze that consumed hundreds of documents from the 1840s. Some called it an accident. Others called it suspicious. And still, others claimed certain men had waited decades for a chance to bury the past one final time. But enough fragments survived in newspapers, in personal letters, in court transcripts stored in other counties to ensure her story could never be erased completely. Today, historians debate the details. Some say the scandal was exaggerated, that memory cannot be that perfect, that one woman could not bring down 12 powerful families in a time when enslaved voices were considered legally worthless. Others point to the facts. Dozens of court rulings overturned, families ruined, land restored, political careers ended, and a pattern of corruption so intricate only a mind like Eliza's could have exposed it. The truth likely lies somewhere between the surviving records and the silences they cannot fill. But one thing is certain, Robertson County was never the same after her, and so, in the years after her death, her legacy became something larger than a legal triumph. She became a symbol whispered in the South, a reminder that the past is never as buried as powerful men wish. That truth waits, that memory survives. That even a single voice, silenced for 2 decades, can rise at the right moment and burn an empire to ash. Eliza Harwell did not destroy those 12 families with curses or witchcraft or second sight. She destroyed them because they believed she was nothing. They believed she could not remember. They believed she could not speak. They believed they would never face consequences. They were wrong. And in the end, it was not fire, nor violence, nor rebellion that brought them down. It was memory sharp, precise, undeniable. It was truth spoken at last. You've reached this far. Tell me, do you believe Eliza's story is fully uncovered? Or are there still secrets buried in Robertson County waiting to surface?